Okay. Welcome everyone to this third in a series of talks on digital humanities across the faculty, hosted by the Research Institute for the Humanities at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm David Hudder. I'm the director of the Research Institute. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Many of you will know him, James St. Andre, who's the chair of the Department of Translation here at the Chinese University. He's also director of the Center for Translation Technology. James has written and edited numerous books, including Translation as Cross-Identity Performance, published by the University of Hawaii Press, 2018. And he's interested in theory and history of translation and Chinese English translation and digital humanities. So this is where he comes in today. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to James, and his talk is titled Found Corpora. What? Why? How? Welcome, James.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. So I'm first, let me just say that the talk is a little bit long, probably about 50 minutes. I would encourage you, if you have questions along the way, to type them into the chat. And then when either I get to a point where I want to take a pause, or if we get to the end, we can then go back and look through the questions that are in the chat and answer them. So please feel free to use the chat function as we go along. So I'm going to share my screen now and start the slideshow. So is that clear? Okay. All right. So very basic title, what, why, and how of found corpora. So very simple definition of found corpora is that they are pre-existing digitized collections of texts. So these are basically things that you find typically online. They have been created typically by someone for a particular purpose. Usually that purpose is different from the purpose that you coming in or finding that corpus online are using it for. And that's something that we'll be keeping in mind later. They're often quite large, which means that they often contain quite a lot of material that's completely irrelevant to what you are trying to do. So often one of the things that you have to do with found corpora is to figure out a way either to search through and identify what is interesting, or you have to find ways to extract small amounts of material that you can then use in some other way. Usually they are accessed via an interface that is both proprietary and unique. And this poses various problems when you work with different corpora at the same time for a particular study, because then the different databases that you're using have different functions, and so the way that you get your results from them will be different. So found corpora may be free, open access, by subscription, or sort of hybrid where some of the information is available freely and some of the information is available only by subscription. And I'll be showing some examples of these different ones later. So I've organized my examples really around the topic of my latest book project, which I just sent the manuscript to the publisher a month ago. So I'm looking at 4 keywords relating to China and looking at how those keywords have changed both in Chinese and English over a long period of time. So I'm talking centuries, from the 15th, 16th century all the way up to the present. So those are faith, feng shui, filial piety, and guanxi. And we'll get to some specific examples later. But so for this project, these are examples of corpora that I have used of books. So early English books online claim to have digitized every book in the English language published before 1700 that they could find. 18th century collections online picks up where Ibo left off and runs up until 1800. Then I switched to Google Books and the Internet Archive, mainly for the 19th and early 20th century. And then in Chinese, I've used mainly RT Library, Chinamax Digital Libraries, and the Index Corpus Material relating to the history of Chinese late imperial and modern thought, which is because I'm particularly interested in the late Qing and early Republican era, because there's a lot going on in terms of translation and shifts in meaning on some of these terms in this time period. For other types of examples of found corpora, academic articles, so things like Google Scholars, JSTOR, Project Muse, in Chinese, China Journal Net is one that I've used quite a lot. You probably use these to find individual articles on a particular subject. I use them sometimes to do statistical analysis of what has been published about a particular topic, so bibliometric studies. Then I've also used newspaper corpora. So the big one in English is ProQuest, ProQuest Historical Newspapers. Very interestingly, has a group of English language newspapers published in the Chinese treaty ports and Southeast Asia from the 1820s onwards. So those are an important source for my project. But then in Chinese, we also have the Old Hong Kong Newspapers database, which is compiled by the Hong Kong National Library. And then Newspaper Appleby, and then People's Daily for more current what's going on in the 20th and 21st century. Some more unusual examples of found corpora that I have used include WorldCat, and actually that's going to be one of my main examples today. So WorldCat is a bibliographic reference tool that combines the catalogs of over 10,000 libraries across the world. And I've used that to look into, again, for bibliometric studies, but also for topic identification. Again, I'll have an example of that later. Wikipedia, I haven't worked with that very much, but other people in translation studies have done quite a lot with it. Then also things like social media, anything where you can capture and download text, so Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, WeChat, Instagram, all of these are used by researchers as corpora for studies. And then the last one I put down just because I think it's quite fascinating. The BBC News Service has an archive of news broadcasts that are closed captioned for the hard of hearing. And because it has the closed caption titles in it, you can search through the news archive to find footage of news items relating to particular topics. So that's been used by people doing research and translation. So why do we want to use them? Well, very simply, because we can. Because it's a great resource, and because the alternative is much, much worse. So my example of this is my very first PhD student at the University of Manchester did a study where she compared detective fiction written in Chinese and published in Taiwan with detective fiction that had been translated into Chinese and published in Taiwan. So she's looking at the differences between translated texts and texts written in Chinese by native speakers. And she's trying to look at the differences in language use in those two types of works. And it took her essentially 2 years to digitize 20 books. So she didn't even have soft copies of the books. She had physical hard copies of books. She had to scan them page by page. Then she had to run OCR software to convert the PDF files to text files. And then that conversion process has a high error rate, especially for Chinese. And so she had to proofread every single page to correct errors. And so this whole process for 20 books took her 2 years. So if you can find a corpus online that you can use, it's so much easier than trying to compile your own corpus. It's therefore time-saving, and also you often can gain access to material that you would not have access to otherwise. So many of these databases contain material that are not readily available elsewhere. Some caveats, so some issues to keep in mind when we're trying to use these kinds of databases. First and foremost, these databases, again, as I mentioned before, were originally designed for some other purpose. They were typically not designed to be used as a corpus. And so therefore, there's a certain amount of jiggling that you have to do, or maneuvering that you have to do in order to get the corpus into some kind of a format, or extract information from the corpus in a way that is then useful for your own particular research project. They often contain dirty data. In other words, they often contain errors. So a good example of this is early English, 18th century collections online, that collection from 1700 to 1800 in English. All of the texts are available both as PDF and as text files, but the text files were converted automatically using OCR software, and they have never been proofread. So they contain lots of errors. And actually, I did a study a few years ago looking at some of the databases, and I calculated the error rate for 18th century collections online. And for especially some of the older texts, the error rate can be as high as 20%. So that means that 1 in 5 letters, not words, but letters, is wrong. So if 1 in 5 letters is wrong, then that means that most words are going to have typographical errors in them, which means that when you try to search them, you're not going to find what you're looking for. So as you get into the 19th century and books are printed with using more modern typefaces, which OCR software works better with, the error rate goes down. And for 20th and 21st century books, the error rate is very low. But if you're looking at historical data, then this is often a problem. The other thing is that each database is different, and so therefore they're not standardized. And so if you're trying to use more than one database for the same project, if you try to do quote unquote the same type of search in the two databases, you may not get comparable results. And for me, the most annoying example of this is that EBO, Early English Books Online, and ECHO, 18th Century Collections Online, done by the same group in the United States, but the search functions are different because Early English Books Online, the texts have been, in most cases, manually corrected, and ECHO, all the texts were done automatically with OCR, and so they have all these errors in them. So when you do a search in EBO, actually you have a much better chance of finding material that you're looking for, if it's there, than in ECHO. And so if you are looking at trends from earliest publication up to the 18th century, sometimes what happens is you find a drop when you switch from one database to the other, because the second database is not finding as many examples, but it's because of the error rate. It's not because that suddenly after 1700 people stopped publishing texts about that particular topic. So if you're doing any kind of statistical analysis or any kind of quantitative study of this kind of material, this is a big problem. Of the fact that when you collect your material from different databases, the different databases have their own unique issues, and then you have to try to figure out some way to kind of level the playing field to get a kind of a consistency over time. So then, given that if we're going to try to use them, how do we do so? So I'd say that there are two main ways to use such corpora. The first one is to use their proprietary search functions. So in other words, to use them more or less the way that the people who designed them were thinking about. So you get it to the website of, the homepage of whatever database it is. You go to their search function. They all have some kind of a search function. And then you use that search function to generate results. And then you look at those results, and either you compile statistics, or you do close reading, or whatever kind of approach you want to use. But basically that you work primarily or exclusively through their search function. The second way, which is not always possible because some of the databases don't allow you to do this, is to download part of the material from the database and then to build up your own mini corpus, and then use your own tools in order to look at that material. So this may or may not involve using their proprietary search function first in order to identify the text that you want to download. If you're doing this with a large database and you're downloading a lot of information, especially if you're doing it in an automated fashion, so if you write a script in Python to do this, this is sometimes called data mining, or when we talk about things like downloading material from Twitter or WeChat and things like that, that's sometimes called data scraping. I didn't put that on the slide. If you want to do this kind of thing, you have to be aware that many databases have strictures against excessive downloading. So in other words, if they catch you doing that, you can be banned, and you may even be fined if they can get a hold of you. So you have to be aware, if you do decide that you want to download material, that you do it in a way that is responsible and is in accord with their the rules set out by the company, especially if it's a subscription service. If it's a free access one, then normally they don't really care what you do. And the main reason that they don't like excessive downloading is because it puts a strain on their server. So now I'm going to give you some examples. An example of the second technique that I talk about, downloading material from a database. So for my project, again, looking at these key concepts relating to China, both in English and in Chinese, I use the Internet Archive to build up a database. So I call this the long 19th century English language books on China. So what I did is I looked through the Internet Archive to try to find examples of texts written in English that were about China. And then I downloaded those texts. So I found 243 texts dating from 1653 to 1983, but the 17th century material is sort of outliers. So there's just a few sort of early texts that are in the database. Most of the texts are from the period 1810 to 1920. So I downloaded all these books from Internet Archive, which is perfectly legal. They don't care because they're all in the public domain. And the Internet Archive allows you to download both PDF version and text version of all the books that they have in their library. So I downloaded both so that I could first use Microsoft Word search function to look through the TXT files. And then in some cases, I needed to look at the PDF text to verify if there were mistakes, or sometimes if I was like trying to find the page number. But anyway, so I was actually using both. But so for this particular aspect of my project, I did not use a sort of more specialized software program like Wordsmith tools for a corpus. I was just using the search function in Microsoft Word to look through all of these books that were published mainly in the 19th century about China, written mainly by British and some Americans, to see what texts had talked about face, feng shui, filial piety, and guanxi. So I didn't search for just those 4 words because, of course, sometimes people don't use the exact word that you have in mind. And also for words that are transliterated, like feng shui, there are about a dozen different ways that that word is written in 19th century texts by different authors. So I actually have wound up having a spreadsheet where you can't even actually see all of them. But if you look across the top, I searched for a whole bunch of keywords that were related to the concepts that I was interested in all of these books. You can see the author is on the left, and then there's the title. It's been cut off, the date of publication, the publisher. And then, so for feng shui, for example, I searched for feng shui, but then I also searched for the term geomancy, because geomancy is another word in English for this that's used as a translation for feng shui sometimes. And then I was also interested in whether or not the people who were talking about feng shui had any kind of sort of deeper understanding of what was meant by feng shui and the underlying concepts that underpin feng shui practice. So the most common terms that indicate that are if the work also talks about yin yang and 5 elements, Wu Xing, because those are 2 of the fundamental ideas that kind of undergird the whole practice of feng shui. So I was looking not just for that one word, but for all these other words. For filial piety, I basically only used filial piety. For face, I wound up just using face. But then for guanxi, it's a little bit complicated, but basically the word guanxi isn't really used even in Chinese until the 20th century. But the concept is around. And so I had a whole suite of terms relating to what I conceive as the concept of guanxi that I was then looking at in these texts to see whether or not these kinds of topics were coming up. And so then you can see I have this spreadsheet, and obviously no means I didn't find that particular item in that particular book. And then if I did, I put down the page number and so forth. And sometimes I have notes. You can't really see there. That's a little bit, okay, so we're going to keep going because we have a lot to go. So this allowed me to then trace from the early 18th century to the early 20th century what's going on in the discourse that is being created by English language speakers who are writing about China in relation to these 4 topics. Couple of points to make about this. I have to say that the way that I selected the text probably could have been a little bit more rigorous, because it started off really with texts that I knew about. So, for sort of fairly well-known and famous texts. Also then texts that I just happened to see references to. And then eventually I decided that that wasn't enough. And I did a search through the Internet Archive's search function using keywords China, Chinese, and a couple of others to try to narrow it down, because that gave me too many results. But I didn't download everything. So again, I said I wound up with 243 texts. There were a lot more than that. So I was going for a sort of more of a representative sample than everything that I could find for this particular part of my project. Then I used the material that I downloaded, I would say, in 2 different ways. So I did both quantitative and qualitative work with this material. So quantitative, I did, statistical things, counting, the number of times, the percentage of texts that did or did not discuss these topics. So for example, finding out fairly quickly that certain topics, the filial piety was much more commonly talked about in these texts than feng shui. But that as the 19th century goes on, toward the end of the 19th century, the number of texts talking about feng shui increases dramatically after about 1870 or so. So like the last 2 or 3 decades, of the 19th century is when feng shui really seems to start to capture the imagination of people writing about China. Before then, it was mainly a kind of oddity that they kind of mentioned briefly. So I did that sort of statistical analysis, and then I also did close reading of selected passages of works that seemed to be important. And so for that, for example, going back to feng shui, I discovered that there is a text written in I think it was 1879, called Feng Shui, by this guy Eitel, a British, a Brit who was living and working in, I think it was in Shanghai at that point. So he writes an entire book on the topic, and that's the sort of first major work that talks about feng shui, lays out in great detail the underlying concepts and how it's related to Chinese notions of the cosmos, and so on and so forth. So obviously that particular text I then read carefully and did an analysis of what was going on in that particular work. So I'm doing both, kind of looking at statistics, kind of getting a broad view, but then I'm also selectively going in and looking in more depth at particular points. Also, again, because of the error rate of the OCR software, I assume that I missed probably 20 or 25% of the possible hits that I might have gotten for these. But I also assumed that percentages that I missed was probably fairly evenly spread out among the data. So in other words, I don't think that there was like a whole group of texts that I completely missed because of this issue with the error rate, because the error rate is pretty consistent in the 19th century. So an example of the first technique, where I'm just working with the proprietary search engine of the database, and I'm not trying to extract material and then do things with it outside of the database. Again, with feng shui. So feng shui in English from very early in the 19th century is described in English as superstition or superstitious. So the word superstition is used a lot to describe feng shui in English. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this project is to look at how and why what's going on in English might then be influenced what's going on in Chinese, or what's going on in Chinese, how that might then influence what's going on in English with the meaning of these concepts as they develop over time. So I was interested in the question of whether feng shui in Chinese gets described as being superstition. And so I decided to look at late 19th and early 20th century works in Chinese, and to do a search for feng shui and for mi xin. And the reason I had to restrict it to late 19th and early 20th century is because the term mi xin itself is a new word in Chinese in the late 19th or early 20th century, which is used as a translation for the English term superstition. Okay, it comes from Japanese. So the Japanese invent the term using the Chinese characters, and then the Chinese then borrowed it sometime in the 1890s or maybe around 1900. So I looked at this resource that we have, the Index Corpus of Materials Relating to the History of Chinese, Late Imperial and Modern Thought. And then I also looked at the database Old Hong Kong Newspapers. And so what I found is that feng shui comes up in quite a lot of periodicals in the 19th and early 20th century. When we cross-reference that with the term mi xin, then what we find is that in 1904, suddenly the term mi xin and the term feng shui come together and coalesce. And between then 1904 and 1948, 1/4 of the articles that mention feng shui describe it as being mi xin. So we have this very sort of definite point in time, it seems 1904, where feng shui and mixin come together in Chinese. And then I double-checked this with the old Hong Kong newspapers, which contains some newspapers that began in the 19th century and ran into the 20th century, and found similar results, only just slightly earlier. So in these, the first example of where feng shui is linked to the term mixin comes in 1903. And then again, as we go through the database later, mixin is used more and more often to describe feng shui. Right? So in this case, what I'm doing is using the database kind of the way that it's been designed to, search for particular terms and locate articles based on that. And I'm able to pinpoint a particular time period, 1903, 1904, where the Chinese discourse about feng shui seems to be influenced by the English discourse on feng shui because of the use of the term mixin. Okay, so then my last example, which is going to take us a few minutes, it's going to be a little bit longer, is a little bit more unusual, which is why I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it, because this is an example of what I would say is a more creative way of using a database in a way that it was not originally designed for at all, to find some very interesting results. And that is using the bibliometric tool WorldCat, so that this is this interlibrary catalog from all these different libraries around the world, to look at the term feng shui in contemporary English. So feng shui, as I said, in the 19th century, up until about the 1870s, nobody's really paying any attention to it in English very much. They just kind of mention it briefly. Becomes important for Chinese scholars, sinologists, people interested in China. Also, it becomes important to the British, especially in their colony of Hong Kong, which is where I am now, because the British recognized feng shui as a religious practice, and so therefore something that had to be taken into account by the colonial administration. And actually, to this day, the Hong Kong government has actually a separate, specific fund of money that is dedicated to paying feng shui costs. So whenever there's a project in the new territory, and they put in a new road, or they want to do some kind of public works or whatever, any villages in that area can claim that the feng shui of their village has been affected, and they can sue the government for damages. And then there is this special fund that the government uses to pay these villages, like, okay, we're going to come in and damage your feng shui, and here's some money to make up for it. So feng shui is important for the colonial administration in Hong Kong. It then, in the 50s and the 60s, in the US and in the UK, starts to become an academic subject. So people start to become interested in it. But the first popular book about feng shui is not published until 1983. Then if we fast forward, in 1999, I discovered that there were over 100 books being published in English on the topic of feng shui. This trend peaked around 2010, when there were over 500 books published about feng shui in 1 year. And today there are still hundreds of books being published every year on feng shui. And feng shui has become sort of, I would say that feng shui is becoming, or has become, a native concept in English. So people who know nothing about China, know nothing about Chinese studies, may know what feng shui is, and may claim to practice feng shui in some form. So what I'm interested in this period is, as feng shui becomes this native concept in English, how has it changed? How is it different from what I understand as feng shui based on my reading of earlier texts in Chinese? What's going on with this concept in the 20th and the 21st century? So I turned, so the problem is that I discovered, I mean, as I mentioned, that there are hundreds of books being published every year, right? And even after kind of a long process of looking through the results and weeding out duplicates and reprints and so forth, I had 1,436 titles, right? I have no interest in reading 1,436 titles about feng shui, okay? It's not is what I want to do as a researcher. So the question is, how can I, and of course, I don't even have access to all of those books. I only have access to a fraction of those books. So the question was, how could I access the material, and what was I supposed to do to try to make sense of all of that material? And so what I decided was that I would try distant reading, not of the books. So not of, I decided I didn't want to try to compile a corpus of the texts of each of these books. I decided I was going to do a distant reading just of the titles. So here I have to switch to WorldCat. So here, let me put this full screen. So this is WorldCat. And, oh, I've skipped a couple steps. Let's go to, so in WorldCat, you can create your own account. And if you create an account, that allows you to save records and download them and export them. So it's free, doesn't cost you anything. So I created an account. And then if you go to, let's, this isn't the main page. Let's go to the home. So when you land on it, it looks like this. So you can, so WorldCat, it's not just books, they also have DVDs and so forth. But so I decided I was only interested in books. So search for feng shui, just books. You notice that the results, it says 72,908. First thing to know about WorldCat is it has a very nice set of tools to limit your search. So in this case, I limited the search to the language, English. So you notice that the Chinese texts make up the bulk. So there are 65,000 texts in WorldCat that are related to feng shui in Chinese. And then in English, there are 2,770. So you can limit it by language. When you limit it by language, you should note, however, that just now in the sidebar, it said that there were 2,270 works in English. But then when you use that as a filter, you get 8,390. So this is one of the many mysteries of using, again, proprietary search functions on databases. For some reason, actually, there are quite a number of texts that are in Chinese. We'll see that in a minute. Anyway, but I've got it down to below 10,000. And then just to show you, so you can specify the year. So you can see just on the left-hand side, you can see that the number of publications in the 70s are very low, and these are mainly academic publications, dissertations, things like that. And a few of them are reprints of the book by Idle. And then in 1983 is the year that Rosbach publishes her popular book that I mentioned, the first popular book in English. And then the number starts to go up slowly, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 90, 100. Then by 1999, 217, goes up and up and up. It reaches 490, I thought it reached 500. No, 498, so it peaks in 2009. And then goes down a bit, but again, you can see in 2021, there are still 300. So even just that gives you a sort of statistical overview of what's going on. Just to give you an example of a sort of a smaller set. So in 1985, there were 24 hits. Here you see immediately the problem that I mentioned, that even though I've restricted to English, I'm still getting texts in Chinese. But what you can do is you can select just the text that you want and go through and then you can save them. Come on, here we go. Save them into a list. And you can call, so you can see here, actually, these are the lists that I created when I was doing this research by year. So I created a list for today, so you can save them to that list. You have to go through page by page. So there are 3 pages, or you have to go through each page and select out the ones that you want. I won't do all of that. Then when you're done, what you do is you go to your own account, and then you can go to you can look at any individual list that you've created. So here's my list of texts in English about feng shui from 1985. Once you have a list like this, then you can export it. So export to CSV, that basically just means it exports it to a spreadsheet in spreadsheet format. So I exported the data to a spreadsheet, and then combined the different years together, went through, got rid of the duplicates, and so on and so forth. And then what I did was I created a text file. Where is the one that I'm looking for? It's not there. Oh, so I created a text file, which was just the titles of the book. So when you export the things from the records from WorldCat, you get a spreadsheet, and of course, so one column is the title of every book that you in the list. So I just selected that one column, and then I copied that and pasted it into a text file. So I just had the text of the titles of the books. Then I took that text file and I used a program called, this is the wrong section of this. Let's go to raw results. I used Wordsmith Tools 8.0 to compile a list of words, and it's called a word frequency list. So these are all the words that occur in the title of these books, arranged from most common to least common. And so you notice that so there are 2,592 words in all these different titles. Most of them only occur once. So you can see somewhere here. Yeah, here you start to get 2. Anyway, so, but you have a small number of words that are obviously more common. So then what I did, no surprise that feng shui are the most common, by far, even more common than words like the. But if we start looking down, we notice, you get the, of, and, to, right? So what we call the little words for. The next word that's kind of interesting is you, and your. And then the next interesting word is home and life, and then China. So, and then guide. So what I did basically is I started looking through the list of these most common words, and then tried to sort of sort them into categories. And then once I had those categories, I would look further down the list to see if there were related words that I could then group together to make topics. And so what I got after quite a bit of fiddling is some interesting things. So first of all, in terms of geographic terms, even though all these books are published in English and most of them are in the US and the UK, by far the most common geographic terms are relating to China, and then South and Southeast Asia. And then terms relating to the United States, Australia, the UK are much less frequent, right? So feng shui is still in English, heavily associated with China and the Chinese. In terms of spaces, so location, so what type of a space are we talking about when we talk about how they're going to arrange the feng shui of this location? The most common was the home. Home, room, bedroom, kitchen, cook. So you can see how I've gone through the list and pulled out other terms that I think are related to the word home, and clumped them together to get a subtotal. So home and words relating to the home are by far the most common locations, followed by the office. So the word business and the word office and the word work, those occur almost 100 times together. Then there's a sprinkling of other ones. Interestingly, public venues, so market, temple, so any kind of public structure, it's very uncommon. So there are very few of those. Interior is preferred to exterior. So we're talking about the home, we're talking about the office, we're talking about the interior. If we look at what kinds of location these homes and offices are in, overwhelmingly urban as opposed to rural, right? So lots of references to urban, not so many references to rural. And then the first really significant difference is that there are almost no references to cemeteries and burial plots. And this is interesting because feng shui in Chinese starts off basically as exclusively concerned with practices around the burial of the dead. But in the 21st century in English, that has been almost completely cut out. And instead, we have this orientation around the home and the office. In terms of pronouns, it's overwhelmingly you and your. So this is very much oriented toward the reader, right? This is this kind of, we're talking to you about your life, your concerns, your goals, your whatever. In terms of the genre, overwhelmingly, they are some sort of, they present themselves as some sort of a guidebook. So not just a description of it, but a sort of how-to. And in fact, of the question words, the question word how, like how to do whatever, is the most common, followed by what, as in like what should you do in order to, and then the other question words are used very seldom. If we look at ease or difficulty, we discovered that over 300 examples of words for ease or close related synonyms, and only 2 examples of words that relate to difficulty. So these books overwhelmingly present themselves as guides to something that is easy for you to do. Then we come to a cluster of words that I call words of empowerment. So these are mostly verbs. They're strong verbs, they are active verbs, and they have positive connotations. Create, apply, build, change, enhance, attract, improve, transform, sustain, master. So these kinds of words, and energy. So very positive, very upbeat type of words. In terms of goals, again, we have an interesting shift here in English as opposed to Chinese, because love and romance are high on the list of goals, which you don't find traditionally in descriptions of feng shui in Chinese, at least not before the 1980s. And again, in contrast, a topic that was central to feng shui concerns earlier, which is the production of offspring. So feng shui is concerned about the proper burial of the dead to influence the present generation and future generations of a family line, of a lineage. And again, we don't see any real interest in that in the English language materials. So again, it's all about you in your present and not about your children. So it is very much focused on the ego. Then also there's a strong element of New Age found in these works. So in other words, there's a lot of association of feng shui with other practices in the West or in India that have nothing to do with feng shui traditionally. So astrology, that's Western astrology, signs of the zodiac and so forth, not the Chinese, year of the rabbit kind of thing. Magic, crystals, tarot cards, aromatherapy, Reiki, witches, fairies, pagans, palmistry, Wiccan, and so forth, right? So all of these kinds of terms show up quite a lot in the titles. And again, that's something that is a definite shift in the meaning and indicates sort of how feng shui is being located in a broader discourse of maybe alternative practices. So something that is being perhaps opposed to, say, science. And this goes back to my interest in the fact that in the 19th century, feng shui is associated with superstition, because I see a sort of triangles relationship between science, superstition, and religion. And what happens is that feng shui seems to shift its location in this triangle of like different belief systems over time. And then finally, again, something that's quite different from feng shui concerns in Chinese. There's quite a few about pets, so feng shui for your pets. And there are also 13 texts that are humorous books about feng shui, again, which is something that you would never see in Chinese. So, I mean, there are no texts written in Chinese about feng shui that are humorous. It is considered to be a very serious subject. And just to say quickly, when I was talking about the fact that the guidebooks, they said that this is a guidebook for you and that it is easy. Traditionally, books in Chinese are written to be difficult, hard to understand. They're not written for the layperson. They're written for specialist practitioners, and you, as the client of that specialist practitioner, have to sort of subjugate yourself to the feng shui master who is in charge of the process. So in Chinese, feng shui is something that is practiced by specialists. It is kind of abstruse knowledge that is difficult to understand. But in these English language publications, it is portrayed as being something that is easy and that you can do, and I am going to tell you how to do that. So that's an example of the kind of thing that you can do with a little bit of imagination with a found corpus. And I think that what I'm going to do is stop there and see if there are questions or comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, James. Fascinating talk, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions perhaps about the method and perhaps also about the particular research projects that you used it on. So let me just ask if you could use the raise hand feature, then your image, your name will appear at the top left of the screen, and we can then work our way through in order. So please do raise your hand if you have a question.
One question from Professor McCannis in the chat room.
Oh, yes. So in addition to various corpora we might use, you mentioned some programs and techniques that we might want to use to analyze corpora to automate various elements. But can you talk us through the benefits of using them, other applications, etc.? Okay, so that's kind of a big topic. And honestly, I would say that I'm a bit of a neophyte. So I have done a little bit of programming in Python to automate some of these processes. But when I started learning Python about 3 or 4 years ago, actually for this project, because I wanted to try to see if I could do some programming to automate some of this. And the guide to Python that I was using online was called something like, Python for Dummies, automate the boring stuff. And so basically the idea is that it is possible sometimes to write short programs that will help you to sort through a lot of material. So, and at one point I used Python to write a script because I had downloaded a bunch of I had downloaded a lot of data from, I don't think it was WorldCat, it was a different database, but I think it might have been Echo. But so I had downloaded bibliographic information from a database, and it had downloaded into a text file, into a text file, into like a Microsoft Word file. So you have all these entries, and that's not very useful if you're trying to do any kind of analysis. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to convert the Microsoft Word file to a Excel file, to a spreadsheet. And I actually wrote a script in Python to do that for me. So rather than sort of, like cutting and pasting, item by item into the Excel spreadsheet, I got Python to open up the Word file, and then go through and figured out ways to tell it, like when you see this, like a carriage return and then something or other, whatever, then you need to put this, that's, the author, so that's going to go in the author column. And then when you find this, then that's going to go into the title column. And when you find this, that goes into the date columns. So I was able to write a script in Python that would take that text file and convert it to an Excel spreadsheet for me. You can also use Python to write scripts to search WorldCat. So actually, there's somebody, I think at University of North Carolina or University of South Carolina, who was working on this, who was working on using Python to do automated scripts to search WorldCat for information, to compile bibliometric information for a project that he was working on. So those are examples of things that I would do with Python. Wordsmith, what I use, so that last example I showed you with feng shui, I used Wordsmith on a text file. So anytime you download data, if you have it in text format, you can use a corpus tool to look at that entire thing. And corpus tools will typically do a certain number of things. They will tell you, they will do word frequency, like that list that I showed you, what words occur and how often they occur in the corpus. They'll do type token ratio. So that means the percentage of different words in a select block of text, typically 500 or 1,000 words. So like in a block of 1,000 words, how many different words are there in that block? And this is used as a measurement of often of difficulty. So the more different words there are, then the more varied the vocabulary, and so therefore the more difficult it is. It'll give you mean sentence length. So it will be able to, it'll go through and it'll identify a sentence and it'll count the words in the sentence, and then it'll tell you the average sentence length. Again, that's often used to relate to reading difficulty. So if you're interested in those kinds of things. My student, who I mentioned in Manchester, who was working on the Chinese detective fiction, used these kinds of features to try to look at, discovered that the average sentence length of the translated texts were shorter than the average lengths of the texts that were written originally in Chinese, suggesting that there was some sort of simplification going on during the translation process. So Wordsmith has a certain number of functions that they use. Those are the two that I have used the most. Yeah. Is that enough for that question? I don't see. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next. I'm going to move on to the next question then. How do I count the word count in a Chinese corpus? Do you do every character or count the words that have been segmented? So if you're working with Chinese, there are now programs that will segment words for you. And there are also programs that you can get even that will tag words for you. So tagging, I mean, is used a lot in corpus studies. Tags, like part of speech is the most commonly used form of tagging. So these features were first developed in relation to English, and there are certain problems in applying them to Chinese. So, I mean, your question about the word count is exactly this kind of question. I mean, in English, you have spaces between words, but in Chinese, all the characters are just run together and there's no spaces. And so trying to identify a word in Chinese is actually an issue. But so there is software, actually there are several different brands of software that will do that for you. So I would recommend getting that kind of software, segmenting the text into words according to one of these programs, and then using that as your count. And then, so from Vincent Wong, very thought-provoking. How did the Chinese lose feng shui? They haven't lost feng shui. They still believe in it. I'm in Hong Kong. I can tell you there are lots of Chinese people that still believe in feng shui. But thank you for that comment. Zhang Yingyi ask about word frequency you've shown in your Excel file. Did you copy and paste the titles of the books you found from Word in a Word file? Yes, so that's exactly what I did. So I just copied and pasted the titles of the books into a WorldCat file, into a Microsoft Word file. Then I converted that to a TXT file. So Microsoft Word usually works with files that have an extension DOC or DOCX. For Wordsmith and most concordance software, you can't use a doc file because it has too much other information besides the text itself. So you have to save them as a TXT file. So TXT file is basically a plain text file. There's nothing in it. There's no special characters. There's no bold. There's no underlining. There's no paragraph. Very, very little formatting. And so then programs like Wordsmith are designed to be used with that kind of a program rather than, with that kind of a file rather than with a doc file. So you have to save it as a TXT file, and then you can use Wordsmith, and then Wordsmith will do these various things for you. Then Wang Yunyun says, thanks for sharing. OCR software in your corpus may I have any oh, wow, that's a good question. So the question is whether I know anything about OCR software designed for use with articles that contain mathematical expressions and notations. And the answer is, is no. I'm sure there's something out there, but I have no idea. If it's recent material, so if it's modern printed material, there are a few OCR programs that are very, very good. And I would say probably one of those would work, a standard one would work pretty well. But you might have to do a bit of trial and error, or you might have to do a bit of maybe just try searching using Google or something like that, some keywords, OCR, mathematical notation, scientific research, and so forth, and see whether you can find somebody who has talked about this. So, I mean, in terms of OCR software and how it works, I did a study, I mentioned briefly. So I did a study of OCR recognition on English language databases, but then my research assistant did a study on Chinese databases and the issue of error rates. And those two, actually, we wrote two articles. He wrote one about the Chinese, and I wrote one about the English, and we published them in our Journal of Translation Studies, published by the Department of Translation with Chinese University Press. So that was in, well, that was a while ago, 2018, June 2018. So there, if you're interested in some issues about OCR, you might want to take a look at those. Well, 8 messages. Okay. All right. So he's happy. She's happy. English began to use functions that the Chinese have not used before. So, oh yes. Well, yeah. Well, so I would say yes. Feng shui in English is no longer the same thing as feng shui in Chinese. It is. They are to a certain extent becoming different things. And as I mentioned, that it shows certain preoccupations. I mean, really, I'm tempted to say that the English language books about feng shui really show how self-centered English speakers are. It's you in the present now. Who cares about your kids? Who cares about your parents? It's all about you. How can you achieve success? Don't worry about anybody else. Which is very different from the way that feng shui works in Chinese. Yes, that's true. Let's see. Title analysis results may differ across different topics, genres of books. Oh, whether so that's an interesting question. I haven't tried that, but that might be something to do. So yeah, so WorldCat has this function, has a lot of different filters, and one of them is you can select just juvenile. So somehow they have decided that all books in the world can be divided into books for juveniles and books for adults. So I didn't apply that filter. No, I didn't apply that filter. I fiddled around with some of the filters, actually several of the filters, but I might have tried. If I did try it, then it didn't look either. There was essentially nothing in the juvenile when I filtered for juvenile, there was essentially nothing there, or the results didn't look interesting to me for whatever reason. So I didn't pursue it anymore for this particular topic, for feng shui. I think feng shui is, yeah, I have this impression now that I think about it, that I did look, and that there were no titles that were associated with juvenile, that were classified as juvenile. And so that actually tells us that feng shui is also something that is an adult concern, that children or adolescents are, for some reason, not going to be interested in it. Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Thank you. I think I've finished the question. Which OCR software do you use for your research? So I'd refer you to that article that I wrote in the journal for details about that. Or you can send me a message and I can try to give you some more specifics about that. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, James. You've answered a number of questions there as well. So you've worked hard. You've lasted a long time. I'm sure everyone would like to join me once again in thanking you for this fascinating talk. So thanks very much. Thank you everyone for coming.
My pleasure.
I do hope to see you all again in future talks in this series. So thanks very much, James. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.